Hello, my name is Richard Paulson. I'm an assistant professor of economics at Bloomsburg University of Pennsylvania. And the presentation I'll be giving today is entitled Pure Effects in Human Capital Accumulation, Time Spent in College and Productivity in the National Basketball Association. So starting with a little bit of background, I want to first discuss the NBA draft process. So the NBA draft is the primary process by which amateur players enter into the league. Starting with the 2006 draft, a rule was instated that players needed to be 19 or older within the calendar year of the draft to be eligible to be drafted. What this means is that players needed to be at least 1 year removed from their high school graduation. How this has ended up affecting players' decisions is that this means most players end up going and playing 1 year in college before declaring for the draft. We have seen a little bit of change in that in recent years, but still more often than not, players are spending 1 year playing in college, if they're US born, before declaring for the NBA draft. For players who are current college students at the time of the draft, the player can then choose to either enter the draft and forgo their remaining college eligibility, or to spend additional time in college. So players can choose to leave college after 1, 2, 3, or 4 years and enter into the draft. The research question that I'll be looking to answer is, how do additional years spent in college impact subsequent NBA productivity? Now, there are two competing arguments for how spending additional time in college could affect NBA productivity. One argument revolves around the theory of peer effects. So in the economics literature, peer effects are the influence that peers have on you, and these could be positive or negative. And there have been a number of papers that have found evidence of peer effects. And just to give a couple examples, there has been some literature around peer effects in academic performance. And this literature generally has found that having stronger peers improves academic performance. To give an example of how this has been found in the literature, some studies have looked at the impact of random assignment of college roommates. And the results have found that if you have a college roommate that performs better, you tend to perform better yourself. So the roommate might have a positive effect on you. There have also been studies that have found negative peer effects. So peer effects on adverse behaviors, things like alcohol use or crime. Similarly, to the college roommate setting, there have been some studies that have found that, if you're randomly assigned to a college roommate that drinks more frequently, you are also more likely to drink frequently. How would this then tie to the research question? Well, the prediction from a peer effects framework would be that playing against higher quality teammates should improve skill development relative to those that spend more time in college. So if you choose to go to the pros early, say after 1 year, you're going to be playing against higher quality teammates in practice and playing against higher quality opponents in games. And that should lead to improved skill development relative to those that are playing against college level teammates and opponents. There's a competing theory though, and I'm going to generally label this theory as human capital accumulation. So an alternative argument is that spending additional time in college might be good for the development of human capital. Players get to spend more time on the court as the top player on a college team than they would as a non-top player on a professional team. So maybe that additional playing time could be good for skill development. And it's also potentially the case that the star player on a college team might get some extra attention from the coaching and training staff compared to a non-star player on a professional team. The prediction then on this side is that spending additional time playing in college should improve player development compared to those that are spending less time playing in college. So two competing theories here. I want to give a little bit of empirical motivation. And here I've got a short clip from ESPN's First Take.
Max, is leaving for the
Yep.
association the right move for Young?
No, I don't think it is. And I'm not speaking to anyone's financial situation or anyone giving up millions of dollars, guaranteed dollars. I understand that you sometimes have to take that deal. Although I would say if you could take out an insurance policy that would pay the equivalent of your rookie contract, which you should be able to do, then, and by the way, you should somehow be able to finance that, right? I mean, if you can't make money as a college player, et cetera, then I would say absolutely stay in school. I don't think he's ready for the pros. And unfortunately, for whatever reason, the culture of the NBA is such that a high draft pick must start his career in the NBA. I don't know why that is. In baseball, you could be the #1 overall draft pick, and frequently you begin your career in the minor leagues, not the major leagues, where you get to develop. And were that the case, were the culture of the NBA the case, that Trae Young could be drafted up high and still go to the G League and develop there and over a year or two and then go to the NBA, I would be for it. But that's not what's going to happen. He's going to be thrown to the wolves. Ask another Oklahoma product, Buddy Hield, how that goes. And Buddy Hield actually had years in college. Trae Young is good and promising, and I believe he would get better with development in college against players more on his own level. A couple of more years. I mean, we've just seen it in this previous draft. Why was Kyle Kuzma so good? You think Kyle Kuzma would have been good if he came out after his freshman year? Not only would the answer have been no, he may have never developed into this player. So I'm not talking about the idea of just passing up financial opportunity. I get it. If there's a way to somehow hedge your bet through an insurance policy or something, and there is, then I would suggest staying in college and developing. Because if you think it's tough to play in the backcourt in college, there's a lot of defensive focus in college. Do you know what it's going to be like in the NBA in a guard-driven league where that's where the defensive attention goes?
I'm going to stop this here. Now,
Max.
moving on. I want to point out some flaws in Max Kellerman's argument. Now, ideally, what we'd want to test the impact of spending additional time in college on NBA productivity would be to randomly assign some players to spend additional years in college and other players to go directly to the pros after 1 year. The problem, though, is that players do not randomly declare for the draft early. It's typically those players that are of higher ability that are leaving for the pros after 1 year rather than spending additional time. Another point to point out here, too, is that players who are spending additional years in college are typically older upon their entry into the league. So it's important to think about, at what point in a player's career do we want to make the comparison between those players that are playing, spending additional years in college and those that are not. And then to, further, point out the flaw in Max's argument here, he makes a comparison between Trae Young and Kyle Kuzma. And what we see here, if we're looking at Trae Young's college stats, spent 1 year in college, he started all 32 games, he averaged 27.4 points per game, 8.7 assists, shot 42.2% from the field, and 36% from three. Pretty solid numbers that should draw the attention of NBA scouts. Compare that to Kyle Kuzma. If you look at his freshman year in college, he played 31 games, started none of them, and only averaged 3.3 points per game. I don't think any NBA scouts had Kyle Kuzma on their radar after his freshman year of college. But after a couple of seasons, his numbers improve over time, he develops as a player. He gets to a point where he could then get NBA attention. And after his junior year, he did get drafted into the league. In his junior season, he started all 29 games, averaged 16.4 points per game. So this decision to spend additional years in college is often not really, a choice by the player. Kyle Kuzma chose to spend more time in college because he probably was not going to get drafted. It's a two-sided decision. And to give another example of a player that's highly cited as someone who, is a success story of spending additional time in college, you'll hear people reference Jimmy Butler. Well, Jimmy Butler only averaged about 5 points in his freshman season. Again, not enough that he was going to get attention from NBA scouts. So what empirical strategy will I take? As I've started to allude to, a simple OLS regression of years spent in college on NBA performance is unlikely to yield a causal relationship. There are a few reasons though. Certainly there's some omitted variable bias. Lower ability players are going to spend more time in college because they're not going to be drafted if they declare after year one. Second, we do want to think about accounting for differences in age. Players who spend more time in college are older, more experienced. And then third, there's self-selection. So even if we have players that could be drafted that choose to go back to school, they may be doing so because they've got some personal inside information on themselves that makes them feel that maybe going back to college would be better for their development. So there's this self-selection going on as well. How will I address those issues? Well, in a perfect world, we'd be able to do a randomized controlled trial, send some players back to college, send some players directly to the pros. That's not the case. So two approaches are taken. In the first approach, I add some additional controls. I'm going to control for the number of the players pick, their freshman year performance statistics, control for a freshman year point per game, assists per game, rebounds per game, and field goals attempted. I also control for player height. So one approach, I'm going to add some additional controls that could potentially help me to control for ability. But a second approach I'm going to take is to use instrumental variables regression. A little bit of additional detail on instrumental variables regression. This is a strategy used for causal inference when the independent variable of interest is endogenous, which is the case in this study. It allows for the identification of a causal impact of an independent variable x on our dependent variable y by finding a third variable z that's related to x but unrelated to y, beyond that relationship through x. A good instrument must then meet two conditions. It needs to be relevant, so the instrument z must have a strong causal impact on x, and it must be exogenous. The instrument must be otherwise unrelated to y. Then a two-stage procedure happens. In the first stage, a regression is run where x is the dependent variable and z is the independent variable. And then in the second stage, predicted values of x from the first stage are used. And they're used in the regression with the predicted x variable as the independent variable and our y as the dependent variable. So it's a way of kind of capturing the exogenous part of x and using that to then predict y. In this setting, I'm going to use freshman year team performance in the NCAA tournament to instrument for the number of years spent in college. And specifically, I'll have two instruments, a binary variable indicating whether or not the team made the NCAA tournament, and then a variable that accounts for the number of wins in the NCAA tournament. We want to ask then, is this relevant and exogenous? And let me say that I do go through some tests for relevance and exogeneity later on. But thinking about this from a theoretical perspective, in terms of relevance, if a team has strong performance in the NCAA tournament, this is going to lead to increased media attention for the players, increased attention from scouts. People watch the NCAA tournament. Those teams that make a splash, their players are definitely noticed. And then, is this exogenous? I'd argue that the single elimination nature of the NCAA tournament, leads to a good deal of luck and randomness. And certainly to get far in the tournament, you need both a mix of luck and strong overall team performance. It's very unlikely that a single player is going to carry his team all the way through the tournament. And to give an example here, a few years back, Syracuse had an unexpected run to the NCAA Final Four. This happened in the freshman season of Malachi Richardson. Because of this unexpected run to the Final Four, Malachi Richardson ended up receiving extra media attention as was drafted. He was drafted but only played 70 games in the NBA across 4 NBA seasons following being drafted, where he averaged just 2.8 points per game. And currently he's playing in the G League. So, in this case, his team had a good run in the tournament during his freshman season. That led to increased media attention for the player, but that strong team performance in the tournament did not translate into success in the NBA. So, one example of how this instrument could be working. In terms of the data being used, I collect data on NCAA and NBA performance statistics for players drafted between 2006 and 2014. 2006 was the first year here because that was when the one and done rule was instituted. So all players in the sample spent at least 1 year in college. I exclude any foreign-born players that did not play in the US but were playing overseas instead. And then I end the sample period of 2014 to allow for sufficient time to analyze NBA performance into the future. My dependent variables, most regressions will use player efficiency rating per as a dependent variable, although I do have one regression where the outcome variable is an indicator for playing in the season after being drafted. So did you even make the NBA roster initially? The key independent variable is the number of years played in college. And then my instrumental variables here are an indicator for making the NCAA tournament and then the number of wins in the tournament. First, some summary statistics. And I split this up into players that spent 1 year in college and players that spent more than 1 year in college. And what you'll note in this table is that those players who spent 1 year in college performed much better as freshmen than those players that spent more than 1 year in college. And they have higher average points per game, assists per game, rebounds per game, and higher shooting percentages. If we then compare subsequent NBA performance, those who spent only 1 year in college are less likely to be missing their first year stats, which would mean they're less likely to have not made the NBA roster. And it's the case that if you compare their first season per 1 year and more than 1 year players have pretty similar first year per, but by year 5 and even the age 22 and age 26 seasons, those players that only spent 1 year in college have higher per. Now, moving immediately here into some results. The first regression, my dependent variable, is an indicator for whether or not the player is missing their year 1 statistics, so whether or not the player was on the NBA roster in the first season. I start with a simple OLS regression with no controls, where the independent variable is college years played. And in the simple OLS setting, those players that spent more year in college are more likely to be missing year 1 stats. So they're less likely to be on an NBA roster. However, that effect disappears when I add control variables. And I'm controlling for the number of their draft pick, their freshman year stats, and their height. And once we control really for draft pick here, those who spent additional years in college are not any less likely statistically to be missing their year 1 stats. And then last, we have the 2-stage least squares results, the instrumental variables results. I do give first stage statistics here. Specifically, I'm giving coefficients here on whether or not the team made the NCAA tournament, the number of NCAA tournament wins, and then the F statistic on the instruments in the first stage. And what you'll note here is that whether or not the team made the tournament and the number of wins are both statistically significant, as is that first stage F. And the interpretation here is that making the NCAA tournament decreases the number of years played in college by about 0.3, and each additional win decreases years played in college by just under 0.3. So, if you've got a player whose team made the tournament and won 3 games, winning 3 games would put you in the Elite 8. That would shave 1 year off the expected time spent in college. And then if we look at the second stage results, years spent in college does not have a statistically significant impact on whether or not the player made the roster in year one. Moving on to results for year one per. So the dependent variable here is player efficiency rating in the player's first season in the league. First, a simple OLS regression. Here, additional years spent in college is having a negative impact on the player's player efficiency rating in the first season. However, when control variables are added, this becomes positive and significant. So having spent additional years in college with the OLS framework has a positive, significant impact on year one performance. So here, controlling for pick, those players of a similar pick perform at a better level if they spent more years in college. However, in the instrumental variables framework, this coefficient becomes negative. In this case, negative and insignificant. So when we're grabbing this exogenous variation in the amount of time spent in college, no longer finding a positive impact of spending additional time in college on year one performance. Now taking a look at year 5 performance, and now by year 5, even OLS has flipped negative. So in the simpler regression, the OLS results suggest that spending additional years in college have a negative and significant impact on year 5 per. Adding control variables, that coefficient drops a little bit, but remains negative and significant. And then in the instrumental variables framework, that coefficient is larger, negative, and significant. So the results here are suggesting that spending additional years in college have a negative impact on NBA performance by season 5. Do note that the sample size has decreased. There are a number of players that were in the league in year 1. They did not last 5 years in the league. There is a question: should we be comparing performance by season in the league, or should we be comparing performance by age? It's certainly the case that those players that spend less time in college are going to be younger when entering the league. So in terms of assessing player development, it's probably more appropriate to compare players of similar age. So in this setting, we're asking, how does performance by age 22 in the NBA compare for those players that spent additional years in college to those players that have spent less years in college? So in this case, we might be comparing the first season in the league for a player that spent 1 year in college to the third or fourth season in the league for a player that spent 1 year in college to the first season in the league for a player that spent 3 or 4 years in college. And what we see here is that in the simple OLS framework, we found negative significant impact to spending additional years in college on per at age 22. When we control for pick and other factors, that effect remains negative but loses its significance. However, in the 2SLS framework, this impact is negative and significant, suggesting that spending additional years in college has a negative significant impact on performance at age 22. And I find similar results looking at age 26 per. So this might be a 5th season in the league for a player that spent 4 years in college, or maybe the 8th season in the league for a player that only spent 1 year in college. In the OLS framework, this is negative and significant. Adding controls, negative, but loses significance. But this coefficient is large, negative, and significant in the instrumental variables framework, suggesting that spending additional years in college has a negative impact on player development. I do want to touch on instrument relevance and exogeneity. So in terms of instrument relevance, I do want to note that I found significant coefficients on the instruments in the first stage regressions and an F statistic on the instruments that exceeds 10. In terms of exogeneity, I did run tests of over-identifying restrictions after each IV regression and passed those tests. I also ran some OLS regressions to provide some additional evidence here. The instruments are not significant predictors of year one performance in an OLS setting. Freshman tournament points per game is not a significant predictor of year one performance in the OLS setting. And freshman tournament point per game is not a significant predictor of tournament wins in an OLS framework. And if I were to give the coefficient here, it's about negative it's about 0.004. So each additional point per game in the freshman tournament increases wins by 0.004. So even if a player's freshman points per game increased by 10, that would only increase team wins by 0.04. So individual player performance not having a huge impact on tournament wins, and certainly not significant. How should we think about these results? I do want to highlight the findings of a recent working paper by Lee, Moira, McCrae, and Porter. This working paper called into question our test statistics and our rule of thumb of an F statistic over 10 when using instrumental variables. And this paper suggests that we should use a higher threshold for the F statistic or higher thresholds for our test statistics in the second stage. So when thinking about the results of this paper, what I would then say is certainly the instrumental variables regressions are suggesting a negative impact of spending additional time in college. The significance would be weaker based on the results of this working paper here. But at the very least, the evidence is not suggesting that spending additional time in college is having a positive impact. So I would interpret this as either a null impact or a negative impact. So the results give some evidence of a negative causal impact. So it's a null effect or a negative effect. But then we do want to follow up this question with, does this mean that all sufficiently skilled players should go to the NBA early? Well, where does the identification come from in instrumental variables? This simple table gives a summary. Suppose we had a binary endogenous X variable and a binary instrumental variable Z. So think of this as in our setting, maybe our X is either the player only spent 1 year in college basketball or spent more than one, and then either the team had a bad March Madness NCAA tournament or a good March Madness NCAA tournament. In the instrumental variable setting, players that spend more than 1 year in college because their team was bad in the tournament would be considered compliers. Players that spend only 1 year in college basketball when their team has a good tournament would also be considered compliers. We might call those players that spend more than 1 year in college, even if their team is good, never takers. And we might call those players that spend only 1 year in college basketball, even if their team has a bad NCAA tournament, always takers. So the always takers are those players that are going to go pro no matter what. The never takers are those players that are going to spend more years in college no matter what. Identification in instrumental variables comes from the compliers. So that impact of years spent in college on performance in the NBA is coming from those players that spend more time in college because their team had a bad March Madness, or spent 1 year in college or less time in college because their team had a good March Madness. So in terms of what we could say based on the results of this study, spending additional time in college is probably a good idea for the never takers. These players are probably sufficiently low skill that playing against very high level talent would hurt their development, assuming that they'd even get drafted anyway. But these players that are definitely not NBA ready probably do benefit from playing against players more at their level in college. Spending additional time in college is probably not a good idea for the always takers. These players are so good that spending additional time in college hurts their development. So the very top of the draft class, they're going to go pro anyway, and they definitely benefit from doing so. But where this study is really able to make a statement here is on those players that are in between. The compliers here are that middle of the road borderline player. Should they stay? Should they go? For these borderline players, the evidence in this study would suggest that they might develop better in the pros than in college. Or at the very least, the evidence does not say that they're definitely going to benefit more from staying in college. So that's it. I'm going to end here with my contact information. So if you have an interest in reaching out to me and talking about this further, my email is rpaulson@bloomu.edu. You can check out my website to see any of my published work. You can also follow me on Twitter.